Well, we're going to go into a different genre, this one in metal or hard rock, depending on how you choose to do it. And that is Judas Priest. And we are doing British Steel. They're not their first, it's actually mid-career for Judas Priest at this point, which we'll talk about quite a bit. But let's first talk about what was in the montage. In the montage, you heard probably, I'd say, the biggest track on this album. Breaking the Law, and now you're going to hear a little bit of quick thumbnail sketch of Judas Priest because
let's do the numbers first, John.
Numbers, yeah. Numbers. It wouldn't be a segment of mine without doing numbers. Yeah.
Nope, correct. So Judas Priest British Steel comes in at number 168 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 24 in 1980, number 1072 of all time. It is their highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. It did not make Rolling Stone's list, so I'm guessing this is a 1001 album I need to hear before I die.
Yes, this is on there.
Do we have any John specials in these full?
I mean, this is kind of like both, I think, because this was going to get on no matter what. So yeah. I do think it's on 1001 albums, but this was going to be a John special no matter what. So, So Judas Priest formed in Birmingham. Speaking of industrial towns, formed in Birmingham, England in 1969. They have sold over 50 million albums worldwide to this point. They basically had a whole career in the 70s before this album, British Steel, was really where they went from mildly successful to wildly successful. The album before this started the elevation, as we'll talk about. So one thing you need to know about Judas Priest is they changed band members all the time in the 70s, to the point where the band playing here was there's not a single member of the original Judas Priest that is in this band. So the original lineup is vocalist Al Atkins, bassist Bruno Stapenhill, guitarist John Perry, and drummer John Partridge. Unfortunately, guitarist John Perry commits suicide at age 18, and they hire 17-year-old Ernest Chatway, who had been in Black Sabbath when they were called. Do you guys remember what they were called?
Oh, shoot.
Is it?
Earth.
Yep. Yes.
He was in Black Sabbath when they were called Earth at all of 17 years old. So among the other folks that were auditioning at the time was future Judas Priest guitarist Kenny K.K. Downing. So actually one of their former members actually auditioned at this time. Stapenhill also leaves, and Ian Hill replaces him on the bass. And guess what? We finally have a member of the band at that point that is with the band at this point. So there you go. So we'd shedded two members before anybody comes in. So for those that haven't put two and two together, and Matt, I'm sure you have, do you know where Judas Priest's name was derived from?
The Bible?
No. The Bob Dylan song, The Ballad of Frankie Less and
Judas Priest.
From John Wesley Harding, which I
believe
believe was in our first ever episode of Coming
Sure was.
What a pull.
So there's a pull right there. Partridge, who we mentioned earlier, was the drummer. He leaves and is replaced by Fred Woolley. Atkins then goes, the original vocalist, in December 1972. And so we have a lot of different stuff. So then in May 1973, they finally stumble across drummer John Hinch and singer Rob Halford, who was in the band Hiroshima at that point. So at this point, I was almost going to say, name the members of the band, guys, based on what I said, like one of those things. But it is drummer John Hinch, it is singer Rob Halford, it is bassist Ian Hill, and it is guitarist Fred Woolley. That band goes on a tour of continental Europe in 1974, and that leads to a record deal. And their first record deal is with the label Gull, as in like seagull. Gull says, we really think you should have a fifth member. And they take on second guitarist Glenn Tipton, going to be an important name there because he stays for a while, from the band Flying Hat Band. So it is now Ian Hill, as we mentioned before. It is now guitarist Chris Campbell, so he's the guitarist there, as well as Rob Halford and Fred Woolley. Okay, so they released the album Rock-A-Rolla, not rock and roller, like Rock-A-Rolla in 1974, and it completely flops to the point where they are in like significant financial peril. They tell stories about only eating like one meal a day, like a sandwich meal, and giving themselves stipends, for how much they were able to eat or do that day. Of course, the stipend basically doesn't include beer. But they're so serious at this point, right, that when they're recording Sad Wings of Destiny, their next album, they had a budget and they actually stayed sober. A, because they wanted to put a good album together, and B, because they couldn't really afford to buy booze as well. That's how hard up they were. Wow. So at that point, the band is mixing prog rock and hard rock. And that is what the Judas Priest sound of that time is. And I did go back and listen, and it is a very different Judas Priest than this Judas Priest that we're going to be covering in British Steel.
Did you like that prog rock, John?
It was not my favorite version of Judas Priest, I would say. Yeah. So, and they were not necessarily great at that style, I would say, either. So, needless to say that at this point, punk is rising. It's like 76 going into 77, and the album sells poorly. What Sad Wings of Destiny does do is where Rob Halford begins to sing in what would be described as soaring vocals, which obviously by British Steel is a hallmark of the band, and they begin to mess around with a heavy riffing style, which once again is definitely something that British Steel brings. So at this point, you would think, oh, well, they're either going to close up shop or just kind of ride it out. But of course, instead, what they do is change band members again. So Alan Moore, who's the drummer, he actually leaves for a second time, and he actually never returns after that time. The band also leaves Gull and ends up signing with CBS Records, which ends up being a pretty big deal for them, because CBS Records, despite, with what you've heard right there, not really having a logical reason to kind of get behind the band, decides to get behind the band. So they hire session drummer Simon Phillips, and the band releases their major label debut, Sin After Sin, in April 1977. It sells pretty well, better than the other ones at least, but they're certainly not a huge band. At this point, they're so not a huge band that session drummer Phillips is asked to join the band, and he goes, not so much. And he declines being in the band, so they hire a gentleman by the name of Les Binks as well as the drummer. And so he's in there. They release an album called Stained Class, not Stained Glass, Stained Class, in 1978, followed shortly by an album known as Killing Machine. One of the big things that happens right here is that the drummer they hire, Les Binks, is actually classically trained, and a lot of people mark that as a huge piece of Judas Priest's sort of increase in musical accomplishment, because he is a solid piece of the band. They can sort of play around him, if that makes sense. He's versatile as well, so they can play a lot of different types of music. I guess before there were some limitations in their drummers that didn't allow them to write certain types of songs. So the band keeps getting heavier leading up to British Steel from that moment where they almost go up. And shortly before the recording of the album, just as they found their drummer, Binks quits in a royalty dispute and is replaced by Dave Holland. So I was just talking about Binks, and guess what? He is not on this album. It's Dave Holland. Amazingly, the version of the band that we have here, which is Halford on vocals, Holland on drums, Tipton on guitar, Campbell on guitar, and Hill on bass, stays together for an amazing 6 albums, beginning with this one.
Wow.
So that is the 1980s version of Judas Priest.
So that's them in their heyday.
This is basically where they become. Priest. This is where the new wave of British heavy metal is becoming a huge thing in England, and they are at the forefront of that. This album was recorded at Matt and Josh Don't Laugh, Tittenhurst Park. Do you guys remember where Tittenhurst Park, like how we know Tittenhurst Park?
John Lennon.
It is the home of Ringo Starr, actually. Matt,
I think John Lennon was there before.
Was he? Okay. So it was described as the home of Ringo Starr, the home studio as well. And it was actually released at a sales rate of £3.99, $3.99. I was going to say cents, but it's pounds, right? So 3.99 pounds, which was considered a value CD in England, and often led to the album being called British Steel. Steel, guys. Get it? British Steel, not Steel. Yep. And as you might not be surprised, this album was actually pretty much universally praised by critics and considered one of the first albums that would be considered to be metal that critics really latched on to. So that, and it's one of the seminal releases of both metal as well. Certainly it's a tier 1 release of the new wave of British heavy metal as well. So that's a little bit of a thumbnail sketch right there. I think, Josh, you are our first take on this, right? British Steel, thoughts?
It's great. I feel like it sets the stage for everything that I like about metal, especially like this 80s metal and the British new wave. I love, like you said, the guitar riffs are classic on this, and I love Rob Halford's voice is great, and he has like a strength and a power to it, and he's able to take it really higher than I could ever think to achieve or even want to achieve in singing. And the thing I found most interesting is that it's not really, metal gets kind of this reputation for being dark and like moody, and like Sabbath's talking about, well, the old Sabbath is talking about like dark themes and witchcraft, magic, and all that stuff. But the topics here and the themes are not really dark or negative. They're pretty positive, and I feel like that kind of goes along with some of the soaring vocals of it. It's about unity and thinking for yourself, being on your own, and then they also go into, well, breaking the law, I guess, is kind of negative, but it's such a fun, like, all-time classic song that how could you not want to like rock along with it? And then things like Metal Gods, which is more, I guess, self-referential, but I just love the guitar in this. I love they have some great kind of transitions and they do different things. Like on Metal Gods, the chorus drops down to a lower register than you would expect it to go high, but they kind of go low. They on a song like Red, White, and Blue, it's more about, it's more about like, again, like unity and the, I guess, the flag, like the Union Jack, more than anything. But it just has a great energy to it. It's such a great introduction to metal. If you were new to it or were interested in it, this would be a great place to start. I don't have anything bad to say about this. It's just such a fun listen overall.
Yeah, this is kind of piggybacking off of what we talked about with Black Sabbath. This is kind of touching that realm of like the area, the type of music that I really liked as one of the first loves that I had as a kid was like just hard rock metal. Probably for me, it was more in the form of hair metal, but still like big guitar riffs, upbeat, fast-paced rock songs, heavier rock songs. And so there's great riffs on here. The only song I knew on this was Breaking the Law, but I really thought that the first four songs in particular, Rapid Fire, Metal Gods, Breaking the Law, and Grinder, was just... It was a really good opening to this record. Breaking the Law's probably got one of the best all-time guitar riffs ever. Like as soon as the first time I ever heard that guitar riff, I was just like immediately captivated. Just ears peaked up. I was like, "What is that?" That just
you and Beavis and Butthead.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was. And I was just like, it's just great. It's melody, right? It's so melodic, and that's what a lot of great metal is. Yes, it's heavy. Yes, it's loud and hard, but like it's the best stuff is melodic too, and that song has it all over the place. That's a top guitar riff of all time for sure. And so like those guitar riffs from Rapid Fire, Grinder's got a great guitar riff. That was a good one to pick for the opening here, John. Metal Gods, I liked it towards the end. It's kind of like they jam out on it a little bit, so they kind of they do something that's they don't do a whole lot in metal, which is just kind of like do a little bit of an extended jam. So I did like that because it's an awesome part, and why not go along with it a little bit longer? A couple of songs on here, it's not like I dislike them, but then I feel like it definitely lost its fastball for a couple of songs. United seems to be a little bit, it sticks out as being a little bit of an odd track here. What's that?
Kind of like an anthem.
Yeah, it's like an anthem, but it's also, it's not a particularly strong one. I think that the guitar riffs and the verses are pretty good, but the chorus kind of loses me. It just seems out of place here. It seems a little bit... I don't know, musically a little bit beneath them, So it's fine, right? But after you get that 1, 2, 3, 4 punch in the beginning, and then it kind of slows. I don't mind it slowing down, but I was left wanting a little bit more there. And then, like, you don't have to be young to be wise, and Living After Midnight, I like them both fine, but they are definitely a step down for me in terms of just and I know that Living After Midnight is a huge classic metal song, but I just don't think it's as strong as some of these other songs, the first 4 in particular. I think they're kind of they're starting to fall a little bit more into the generic side of things for me, and I don't see the greatness in those songs. I like them fine, but I don't get as amped for them as I do the others. They just seem to be a little bit weak. But then they bring it back with The Rage and Stealer, which I think are really good ways to close out the album, kind of getting back to more interesting, maybe a little bit more aggressive, guitar parts, or just really better riffs or stronger riffs, I would say. And that's really where this band's strength lies. It is just really good guitar riffs and beats behind that. And they've got that all over the place here. This was a really fun listen. It kind of brought me back to, like, because I don't listen to heavy metal a whole lot, like, recreationally. It's just something that if it comes up, like, in a playlist or in a mix or just whatever, I like it fine. But it's definitely not something. I'm not a metalhead, although I do like it quite a bit. And but I'm glad we got to do this, because this is I've always known Judas Priest, heard a lot about them, didn't really know many of their songs, and I'm glad I got to know this. So definitely thumbs up on this. They're a great band.
Yeah, it's funny because Priest is considered metal, right? But I've always considered them to be similar to AC/DC, in that they're like a blues rock band that just plays heavier and faster at times. And I think that was the first thing. I mean, I've heard British Steel, 50, 60 times in my life at different points. I mean, it was an album that just consistently got revisited for me because it was a seminal metal album, and I like metal, right? So you go back to figure out where stuff comes from. But I think, having just done a couple AC/DC albums, I was really pardon me for a second. I was surprised how similar it sounds to some of the AC/DC albums we did, with the blues-based grooves. Now, their Judas Priest is more riffy. I would say there's more guitar riffs as opposed to grooves, right? Like where AC/DC is more groovy, where Judas Priest is more riffy. But yeah, you have for those that haven't heard Judas Priest, right? Let's go over like what Judas Priest is. Big guitar riffs, super catchy, singable hooks, right? Is a hallmark of Judas Priest. Followed by Rob Halford's like implausibly soaring vocals, and of course the image of them. By this point, they've established the like leather guy. Yeah. Going back to the album before this, which I'm trying to remember what I always know it as Hellbent for Leather, but it's got an actual formal name. That was the American name of it, and I'll go back and remember exactly what it is. But yeah, I mean, there's a couple songs, and Matt mentioned both of them, that are definitely dated and of their time. Living After Midnight is basically a Kiss song. In fact, it's exactly a Kiss song. The guitars. I mean, that's the theme. The theme is Kiss. It sounds like it's like the greatest Kiss song the Kiss didn't write is "Living After Midnight." So, when Matt said like it's a metal, like a classic metal, I wouldn't necessarily call that a like metal song, right? It's
like in the canons of like it's a song that like metal, like people love that song, and it's something that's played a lot, and it's classic in that sense that it's been. That's widely known and people seem to love it, like it was a hit.
What Priest was really helpful for, though, in terms of context, is bringing metal into the mainstream. And I think that's where it's interesting as a point for you guys, too, because I don't think of either of you guys being real metal aficionados or guys that seek out metal. But, like, British Steel is, like, a very easy entry point into like listening to something that could reasonably be called metal, right? But also is completely accessible. And like up until this point, metal was not fully established, and anything that had metal sounds just was heavy and kind of put to the side. And then, metal would splinter after this into stuff that was harder and more genre specific, and kind of almost anti-commercial. But this is sort of these new wave of British heavy metal bands, especially in Britain, right? They were contemporary in Britain in terms of as popular music, them and Iron Maiden and even at the beginning, Def Leppard was considered like a new wave British, the early Def Leppard, not the Def Leppard that blew up and stuff like that. These were bands that Venom and stuff like, they were all like bands that were commercial. And in America, they weren't as commercial, but what they were was they were laying the foundation and being listened to constantly by, you know, Metallica and Slayer and stuff that were coming shortly after this, that, you know, these were their sort of, you know, metal gods, right? That they then took templates of it and they became, you know, really, I would say in America, right? You know, it's probably Metallica, which is who takes metal into the mainstream, so to speak. And I think Metallica is kind of a more unlikely person to bring metal in the mainstream based on what they were in the 80s, whereas, you know, a prog rock band that, you know, also played blues rock that becomes heavier kind of makes a lot more sense as, oh, well, then they'll be, you know, you know, they make sense kind of as a entree point.
It's
and,
a
you
more
know,
natural progression for
an Iron Maiden
listeners.
at this. Exactly. And Iron Maiden sounds a lot more like a punk band, their first couple albums, too. They're self-titled and Killers. They sound like more like punk albums. And so they were also kind of getting the sound of what this was later. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine that somebody would not like British Steel. It's just, it's the rare album that is extremely important in terms of commercializing one of the bigger genres of music from this moment forward, metal. I mean, if you go album sales, I think people don't realize it as much, but like metal in many cases, I think outside of country music, right, and hip hop, is probably the third biggest selling genre since this time, right, in 1980. And this is the beginning of when you could listen, and you know, and Priest, of course, has another whole life in the 80s with the subliminal messages stuff. I don't know how much you guys know about those whole trials, but
they made people kill themselves.
Well, that was what was claimed and refuted, by the way. But it's basically two gentlemen made a suicide pact after listening to actually a Judas Priest album before this album. And they did it, you know, 4 years after this album. I think 84 was when it happened. And yeah, it was sort of, the family said that and you, that's why it was making me laugh, Josh, that you said, well, this album doesn't have any of the really heavy, and yet this was the one that was claimed to be so demonic, right? That,
this is,
you know,
the satanic panic of the 80s and stuff. I think that plays
That
in.
was
but
such a
that even
huge
goes
thing.
back. That even goes back to the 70s when people thought like Kiss was an ominous band, and you're like, Kiss, like,
well, and AC/DC, remember on Highway to Hell?
AC/DC, exactly, yeah. So I mean, you listen to these bands now, and the idea of AC/DC. I mean, AC/DC sounds like more of like a sexed up band than anything ominous, and Kiss looks like a gimmick. You know what I mean? And Judas Priest is like, oh, they're like an easy, like hard rock band, you know, and oh, look at the leather, you know, they're riff heavy, you know, and Iron Maiden, like, look at them. But at the time, they were all considered, you know, to the point where I always think of like Bill and Ted when like, it's like, put them in Iron Maiden. Excellent. You know, it's like it's Iron Maiden. And I know people who haven't listened to Iron Maiden and Judas Priest their whole life because they think they wouldn't like them because their name infers to them that they're like heavy or demonic, right? Yeah. And which is funny in its own right. It's like, well, have you listened to these albums? Because they're pretty accessible. So, but British Steel, I mean, it's an easy thumbs up. I like this album quite a bit. Do I like it as much as the seminal metal albums we're going to get to? Maybe not, because I look at this as a really strong appetizer course that leads into like entrees I love. Yeah. But you can't have the entree unless you have the appetizer course, and this is like a top layer appetizer course for what's to come in the 80s. So strong thumbs up for me.
So a couple things. One, so I mean, if this is, I felt this was definitely more in the metal realm than the hard rock realm, and you said, you know, you were kind of viewing it as similar to AC/DC, you know, blues rock background. But you also said that this is faster and harder, and I always thought that that's kind of what made metal distinct from hard rock, is it's faster and it's harder, heavier. So, like, how would you? Because this is different to me than AC/DC. It's
more metal than almost anything we've done so far, because it's metal kind of divorces itself from that blues rock tradition, right? Like that's to me a sonic element of metal is that it's a little bit more divorced from blues rock, right? It's kind of like the most metal albums we've done so far in terms of what I think of as metal is actually the early Black Sabbath albums. They have they're heavy. Because metal doesn't have to be fast, right? It could be sludgy. There's a lot of metal that's sludgy as well. So I think that's the stereotype of metal, is that like it's always played like fast, right? And to varying degrees of fast. But there's plenty of metal. I like, Mastodon, Matt, for example, right? And like Mastodon's heavy and sludgy and stuff like that. So like I don't think of metal as always being fast. I think it's a type of rock that's heavy is the number one term I'd say for metal. And also, while everything has roots sort of in the blues rock tradition, metal is way more adjacent to blues rock than traditional, rock and roll chord and verse stuff. Like things like, if we go evolution, right? It's things like the Stones lead into, like you mentioned, Aerosmith, right? And then AC/DC's there. I think where it's similar to AC/DC, where I said it is, it's British Steel and Judas Priest is a little groovier than most metal. This is when like they haven't totally gotten rid of the groove yet, right? Whereas I don't think anybody would describe Metallica as groovy, right? Or like thrash metal as groovy, or and then the question then becomes, what's hair metal? Because hair metal can be groovy, right? Is hair metal just a continuation of blues based rock? Because I don't consider a lot of hair metal, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's definitely a lot of blues rock in metal. Or then in hair metal, and I think we were talking about this last week, Josh, with hair metal being as much about the image and the coming out of glam than more so even than the music. It was just kind of like it's everything was big, right? Like the hair, the makeup, the uniforms and costumes and stuff. So that's a little different. But yes, that definitely I don't know. I didn't hear a ton of blues type music in here. This was a little more distinct than that, but
no, not a ton. That's why I'm saying this is the beginning of the path to metal. But there's blues riffs, there's blues sounding stuff in this, like that. And part of where metal evolves to is they start to strip that from the overall sound more. But you can go from British Steel and make it a little bit more groovy and blues heavy and campy, and you get hair metal, right? Or you could take it and strip it down and play it faster or sludgier, and you can get what became other genres of metal. That's why British Steel is such an interesting spot, because it's just divorced enough from most of the elements of mainstream blues-driven rock that you can identify it, and you do, Matt, as metal, but it also has enough of the elements of blues-driven rock that it's clearly a continuation in that lineage, in a way that if you jumped from like, mid-70s hard rock like Kiss and AC/DC and Van Halen and Aerosmith, right, and you jumped right into Metallica, you'd be like, whoa, that's a pretty drastic, especially early Metallica. Whereas like Judas Priest, if you go those to Judas Priest to Metallica, it makes a little bit more sense.
So they're kind of dipping their toe in a lot more different bodies.
Yeah, and they're bringing in some of the elements of what you think of as metal, like soaring vocals, riff heavy, two guitars, right, riffing in different ways and sometimes simultaneously. That's something that's happening here, with the bass at times. That's a huge piece of the new wave of British heavy metal, that multiple guitar riffing, right? And building to sort of almost operatic choruses. Yeah, I would say those are all things that this genre of what we would call new wave British heavy metal is bringing into metal. That element that later becomes identifiable as a lot of metal because people ended up listening to that and wanting to replicate it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the other thing is, I thought that You Don't Have to Be Young to Be Wise, that guitar riff, I mean, Motley Crue's Looks That Kill must have ripped that guitar riff
without a doubt, like Matt. That's first
And I looked that up and I'm like, there was no real mention of that anywhere that I saw, but I was like, gosh, that's the same guitar riff.
Similar.
So maybe that's why I thought it was a little bit generic, because it reminded me of something else. But
no, it was
it's still
generic.
A good guitar riff. It's still good, but just not as good as some of the other stuff on this. But it's good.
There you go. And it's it's definitely somebody said that like you don't have to be old to be wise. It's sort of like like screw you parents, and that stuff doesn't really age well in this era. But you know, everybody has mistakes, and the totality of this album is really, really solid. So
that's right. I was saying it wrong. You don't have to be old to be wise. I think I said you don't have to be young to be wise. Yes, that doesn't.
Yeah, it's like one of those it's like one of those titles that was common a lot, like really wordy titles in the late set. Like AC/DC had like "It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll" or whatever. A lot of those, in parentheses. So a lot of those type stuff. So.
Yeah.